The data out of New York, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, found that 94% of everyone whose infection was bad enough that they had to go to the hospital, 94% of these people had a pre-existing condition. 88% of them had 2 or more of these pre-existing conditions. And when you look at the list of the pre-existing conditions, obesity is absolute number 1 by a wide margin, over hypertension and diabetes being the next ones. If you put all the obesity classifications in one, which I think we ought to, someone who has too much fat tissue, that is the leading reason that they're going to be hospitalized due to a COVID-19 infection. And to your point, hypertension and diabetes, we are looking at this kind of triad of metabolic syndrome. They are aspects of metabolic syndrome: obesity, hypertension, and high blood glucose, which is type 2 diabetes. Those are all part of this metabolic syndrome, aka the insulin resistance syndrome. One of the most provocative sort of dives into this, and why obesity, why is it too much fat and too much fat cells, the suspected receptor that allows the virus to get into and infect a cell, because that's what has to happen. It's not just the virus is in your body, you've inhaled it. It has to get into a cell to be infectious. One of the suspected a co-receptor for this to happen is called ACE2. And so this ACE2 protein facilitates the virus getting into the cell. What's so interesting is that fat cells are among the highest expressors of ACE2. So fat cells can have more ACE2, this little site where the virus can get into the cell, than almost every other cell in the body. I think it's second maybe just to the kidney, if I'm remembering correctly, oddly enough, although I don't know that people are having kidney problems. But the virus, if you have a lot of fat cells, it's easy to imagine, and I'm speculating, that just is this many more ways for the virus to actually get into a cell, infect a cell, and start replicating. Because that's what it needs to do. It needs to get into a cell, hijack the machinery, start replicating its own proteins, its own virus proteins, and then sharing those with the rest of the body.
Today's show is brought to you by our pals over at blueblocks.com. Leaders in all things related to optimizing sleep and your body's circadian clock system. They have an amazing new product that will help you sleep. It's a new light bulb. I know you're thinking, a light bulb? Why would a light bulb help me sleep? What does that have to do with insulin metabolism? So as we talk about today with Dr. Ben Bikman, as you know, he's the author of the new book called Why We Get Sick. We're going to unpack all things related to hyperinsulinemia, dysregulated insulin, and glucose metabolism. Tacitly implied and interwoven into everything we talk about today is circadian biology. And if I could bet, I would bet inside your home, you have light bulbs that are disturbing your own circadian biology. Light bulbs, for example, like the compact fluorescent LED light bulbs that are emitting a lot of blue light, that if you're using those at night, it's just as bad as staring at your phone or your computer or other devices. It's augmenting and negatively impacting your sleep, your circadian biology, and much more. So Blue Blocks, as I mentioned before, their whole mission is all about optimizing circadian rhythm, sleep, and much more. They have this new red sleep light bulb. You can put it in your home if you suffer from insomnia or you're just trying to optimize and mimic what nature would normally provide for you. For example, unless you're making a fire at night, many people aren't. If you're camping, you might. You're not getting this spectrum of light, and this really helps you release melatonin and sleep better. So you can support your sleep and your body's glucose and insulin metabolism and much more by going over to blueblocks.com. That's BLUBLOX.com/HIH. Again, one more time, that's blueblocks.com/HIH. Use the coupon code HIH at checkout to save. Links will be below, and also links to this amazing book with Ben Bikman. So without further ado, let's cut back to it and talk about all things hyperinsulinemia. Well, Ben Bikman, always great to be with you. Third trip down here to Provo. I love coming down here. Did I tell you I used to work out here all the time?
No.
Yeah.
In Provo?
Yeah. Well, all over Utah. So I lived in Colorado, so I'd come out here quite a bit.
Yes.
And so it's like a home away from home.
Utah's great.
I love it. You've been here 10 years.
When we lived in Colorado, I started my PhD at Boulder. We ended up leaving to North Carolina. But when we got there, my wife is an avid skier. She grew up in Utah, skiing at all the best resorts, worked as a ski instructor. We'd always heard people raving about the skiing in Colorado, and it was good. But you'd have to drive 4+ hours to get there. Here in Utah, I mean, don't let anyone know, I hate to say this, but the skiing is exceptional. And within an hour, you have a dozen resorts that you can get to that are just incredible. Yeah.
Do you ski now?
I do. I ski. My wife taught me.
Okay.
Which means that all my kids will be better than me in just a few years. I'm basically at the level of my 10-year-old now.
That's great.
I've kind of capped out, and they keep getting better.
Yeah, it's
awesome. I
awesome.
couldn't be happier.
It's such a great outdoor activity. I think as with kids, you need to have activities, or else now with all the phones and everything.
And my heavens. You got to try to peel them off. So we want all our kids, they have to have some physical activity they do in the winter, some winter sport and some summer sport. And at the moment it's skiing, and it always will be because my wife is such a skier. And then the summer sport is likely more and more just looks like it's going to be swimming, which is great.
And kayaking.
As long as there's something to do. Yeah, so we have other activities we do as a family, but there's got to be one sport that they do as a sport that they're working on to get better, skiing, and then something else.
That's huge.
Summer, yeah.
And in one of your lectures, you were talking about how you have to use a lot of analogies and stories when you're teaching pathophysiology, right, to your undergrads, because they're so hooked, that you're always competing with Instagram and Facebook.
Yes.
How do you think this stay-home order, and then now with schools being more going virtual, how is that going to affect distractions and learning?
Oh, my heavens. Yeah, it's difficult because now for me, for example, this upcoming academic year, all my teaching is going to be online. So even to listen to me and learn from me, they're going to be on their computer. They have to be on a device to listen to my lecture, just because my class size is too big to do in-person teaching this with current restrictions the way they are. I worry that the experience will be compromised, not just because they don't have direct access to me in the lecture hall to stop me and ask me questions, which is part of the magic of that face-to-face teaching, but now they are constantly going to be fighting with the temptation to be listening to me in one ear and then click away and go onto some social media website and just be distracted, thinking they're getting the information, but not ultimately. It worries me a bit.
It's got to. I mean, there's something to be said about sitting and not, just absorbing everything and not being distracted. I remember, it wasn't until my anatomy and physiology class in undergrad that I really got into science, and if it wasn't for that one professor, so I think there's probably a lot of students that if they don't see you in a person, it could literally probably change their career trajectory or academic trajectory, which is crazy. Yeah,
there's just a power to that face-to-face instruction, that online teaching, as effective as it may be in reaching a greater student body, expanding the platform or the audience size. When I'm up in front of the students, I'm animated, I'm moving around. I will certainly speak differently as I'm basically, and you kind of alluded to this, when I'm teaching my students, I think, what is the story I'm telling? I'm telling a story. And so I will have animations and pictures up on the screen. It's not just a bunch of writing, or it's not a bunch of words. It's me kind of narrating a story, and I'm moving around the classroom. They're keeping their eyes on me. When I see a student who's obviously not paying attention, I will sometimes tease the student, and I'll point them out. And even in a class size of 150 kids, I try to make an effort to learn every name so that I can do that. I can address them and surprise them and tease them. If I see a kid just staring at a screen, I will say, "Hey, what's your Facebook feed telling you right now?"
Nice.
And even actually go over and lean on his shoulder and tease him a little bit. And so I really rely on that kind of playful banter that just keeps the students engaged. It's almost like, I don't know what Dr. Bikman's going to say next, but I want to hear it because it's going to be something irreverent or something funny. Now that I'm starting to record my lectures ahead of time for the fall semester, I just can't capture that same kind of magic. It's too fabricated. As much as I may have a funny thought in my brain in the midst of me talking to my computer screen, I can share that thought, but it's not the same.
Right. So you're going to miss that, it sounds like.
I will miss it.
Yeah.
I will.
Is that something that you've learned through teaching, or have you always been a good storyteller? Because I know I've been going to seminars for a long time, and since 2006, in this industry, and sometimes when you have someone who has new ideas like yourself comes out there, their videos don't always go viral, but every video you put out, or whether it's a recording, they usually get over 100,000 views on YouTube, like within a few months, some way more. Now, I think that's due to your storytelling ability and all that. So is that innate or is that learned?
No, it's learned. I certainly grew up in a home where it was a bunch of personalities always trying to outdo each other. So I think that really helped. Frankly, I come from a very big family, and we're all kind of outspoken, not rude, I hope, but it was always just sort of who can be wittier than the next in the family and get the laughs from the family. So it was a wonderful environment in that regard to help instill my confidence. But it was once I started teaching undergraduates, roughly 10 years ago, where I quickly was learning the trade, realizing I'm competing with distractions. I have to kind of outcompete that. And I looked at other faculty and how they would teach, and how, on the extreme end, it would just be a lecture slide with just a bunch of words. And they were literally just reading the words. Yeah. And as I was sitting through these experiences, I'm rocking back and forth. My eyes are rolling in my head. It was just so boring. And I thought, I just can't do it that way. Yeah. I have to kind of make my own style, which was, like I said, I think of it as a story. And so at these talks that I've given at various conferences, I think part of the advantage is that I teach. When you go to just science meetings where it's just scientists attending, those talks tend to be pretty boring. Although I have tremendous respect for the person giving the talks, you can tell when someone is a teacher as opposed to just a scientist. And for me, I am a teacher and I'm a scientist. I'm expected to maintain an active research lab, and I'm expected to teach a full undergraduate workload, teaching 4 hours a week rather than 4 hours in a whole semester or 4 hours in a year, like a lot of my colleagues that are active scientists. You can tell if a scientist is speaking and they also have a teaching load, they just present well, at the risk of sounding self-congratulatory. And I don't mean to. It's just I had to teach from the very early part of my career as a professor, and it made me cultivate a culture within at least my own mind of how to present information without it being boring. I guess that's the easiest way to say it.
Which is awesome, but it sticks for people in the analogies and the stories.
Yeah.
I mean, you can describe insulin resistance a million different ways, but when you tell it like, okay, my wife has selective hearing, and maybe we can just talk about it, because I think it's a great way for people to go, okay, I know what insulin resistance is.
Yeah, right. So that is, so one of my ways of describing insulin resistance, I never know ahead of time what analogy I'm going to use. It's usually just sort of from the seat of my pants. But the one that you're referring to is how in the different cells of the body will manifest insulin resistance differently, what we call a selective insulin resistance. And that doesn't happen everywhere. Like, let's take some extremes. And even I'll just preface this all by saying, why would we even talk about insulin resistance? It is the single most common health disorder in the country, very likely in the world, as more and more of the world is eating the same diet that we do. And we are not the worst in the U.S. People love to pretend the U.S., and it is pretend the U.S. is worse in every regard, and including metabolic health. We aren't. There are multiple countries. Almost every country in the Middle East, for example, is worse, metabolically speaking, than the U.S. is. And we can, it partly through diet, partly through likely vitamin D deficiencies. But nevertheless, insulin resistance is relevant. How do I explain it? Insulin is a hormone that we all have in our bodies, and it is constantly eliciting actions at every cell. And every cell has an insulin receptor. And at the risk of bringing in another analogy, it's basically like every cell is a room with a door. And insulin will come and knock on that door. And then something will happen in the room. For example, in my house, if someone knocks on the house, the little dog starts barking. One of my kids starts smashing through the house to run to answer the door as quickly as possible. That is an action. So insulin comes and knocks on the door of the cell, and then something happens. And whatever that is, whatever is happening depends on the cell. So let's take some examples like I was getting to a moment ago. On the muscle cell, insulin will tell the muscle to pull in glucose from the blood. It will stimulate, it will help, it will inhibit proteolysis as well. For example, it will block the breakdown of muscle protein, so kind of defending the muscle protein. It will tell it to make glycogen if the insulin's high enough as well. So it's basically facilitating this environment of storing. In fact, that's thematic for insulin everywhere. Take in energy and store it. On the other end of this tissue that has, pure, and muscle kind of becomes purely insulin resistant. If it's insulin resistant, it is insulin resistant. On the other end, you can have fat cells that may never become insulin resistant. They continue to maintain insulin sensitivity by dividing. So this tissue, the fat tissue, is hyperplastic, and the fat cell just splits and splits and splits and splits, and all the fat cells maintain a perfect insulin sensitivity, never becoming insulin resistant. Then in the middle, you have a tissue like the liver, where it manifests some selective insulin resistance. And this is the analogy of like my wife, where, you know, I'm home a lot with the kids these days, especially, but often always. And my wife, who's with them all the time, really kind of has this selective hearing where I will be in another room. I'm in another room with one kid, and Cheryl's in the room with one of the other kids, and I will hear that other kid, mom, calling for mom, and the volume just getting higher and higher and higher, and then it gets a response. Yeah. You know, so my wife, she's sort of insulin resistant, which is, in this case, we're saying like selectively deaf, you know, to the cries of the shouts, I should say, of the children. I'm not around the kids as much as my wife. I don't see this volume as much as she does. I am very sensitive to the shouts of the kids. And so I'm responding from the other room saying, stop, leave your mom alone. Come in. What do you need? Come tell me. But even there, Mike, there's another sort of aspect of truth where a cell that is constantly inundated with insulin will become resistant to the insulin, just like the weary mom is becoming resistant to the shouts of the kids. And yet the spouse, the dad, who doesn't hear them all the time, is very sensitive to it, and he reacts, he responds, he hears it. That's like the cell who doesn't get it very often. This is a fundamental biological principle. And there's debate and disagreement about this. Can insulin cause insulin resistance? And it's unfortunate that it's debated. There are multiple studies from humans to individual cells showing that if you artificially bump up insulin, not even super physiologically, even within the realm of physiological levels of insulin, the body or the cells become insulin resistant. It happens. Now, that's not to say that in chronic insulin resistance that we see all around us, that it's just based on insulin. I'm not claiming that. But without a doubt, insulin is part of this metabolic storm creating poor metabolic health.
And the collateral damage of that is the hyperinsulinemia that drives other imbalances and so on.
Yeah.
I want to dive into that, but going back to the other countries, and I think another kind of statistic that blew me away in the book is only about 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy. So you're saying other countries are worse than 88%? Yeah. So there's in excess of 88% of people, like in Chile and Mexico? And
it's shocking, but really,
wow.
You look through the Middle East, almost any of the countries in the Middle East, and I don't even want to try to rattle them off for fear of embarrassing myself, but Oman, what are some other ones? Egypt even, and all the rest, Middle East and North Africa, Yemen, Saudi Arabia,
Jordan,
United Arab Emirates, Jordan, they outrank the U.S. when you look at diabetes per capita. And if we're looking at that and allowing a little bit of extrapolation, saying, well, before you go to full-blown type 2 diabetes, you have poor metabolic health, presumably they're worse than us, just based on the fact that when it comes to just pure diabetes, they are worse. And we're like number 10 or 11 on that scale. So yeah, the 88% number that I sort of lead off with in the book, it's based on the study from last year finding that 88% of all adults in the U.S. have at least one of the aspects of the metabolic syndrome. Importantly, the metabolic syndrome, this constellation of 5 health problems, used to be called the insulin resistance syndrome, and then its name kind of morphed into this kind of more provocative, more media-friendly version in a metabolic syndrome. But all of those aspects of the metabolic syndrome, high glucose, high waist circumference, high blood pressure, low HDL, high triglycerides, so the last two just kind of being dyslipidemia, each one of those is related to insulin resistance, if not explicitly derivative from insulin resistance. So we're talking about 88% of the U.S. adults having some manifestation of insulin resistance. Even if it's not checked the box of being clinically relevant based on conventional medicine, and that's part of the problem, as we don't really have the tests to detect insulin resistance as early as we should, just because we've never given it its proper attention. But yeah, this is a problem. In the book, I start out with this quiz, basically for the reader to say, this is a global problem. It's the most common health disorder in the world. Do you have it? Go through this little quiz, or think about you, or think about your spouse or your child or your friend, whoever may also check some of these boxes. And then I refer back to that when I kind of get to the end of the book and talk about the solutions. I refer back to that, saying, if you said yes to 2 of these questions, kind of focus on this type of strategy, be really strict with your carbs, for example, or if they weren't as many positive answers to these questions, and you got a little more wiggle room. And there are people, right, Mike? There are people that can eat a diet that is very high in carbohydrates and thrive and be perfectly healthy. Now, that presupposes that it's not coming from processed food, right? Because if you're eating a lot of processed food, the bill comes due.
Yeah.
You can only avoid that for so long. And it's, you know, I'm here at a university where I'm surrounded by wonderful, but occasionally smug 20-year-old dudes, and they'll just say, I can eat whatever I want. And I'm thinking to myself, I remember my buddy said that 20 years ago, and look at him now. You know, it always catches up.
It's really important to mention this and highlight this. I try to do this on Instagram, this metabolically obese, normal weight individuals. And it's roughly based upon the gender, right? Around 25 to 30% of people ish. Mm-hmm. So people, that's the thing. I'm skinny so I can eat what I want, but they don't realize that ectopic or that buildup of lipids within their organs and things that you can't see. Yep. So unless you do some metabolic testing, look at triglycerides or look at glucose, you're never going to know.
No. In fact, I like that you mentioned triglycerides. I really think we underutilize some easy access data here, which is just looking at the triglyceride to HDL ratio. That is what someone is getting that on every blood panel. Everyone listening to this discussion, if they went back and looked at their last physical checkup, or not even a full-blown physical, but any blood test, they're going to have those numbers. They won't have their insulin numbers, which is part of the problem, that insulin is just never part of the conversation because we just don't measure it. You don't need to have it. As helpful as it would be, look at the triglyceride to HDL ratio. And even if you feel and look lean, if your triglyceride to HDL ratio is high, you know, around 2, let's say 1.5 to be a little more strict, or above, you are insulin resistant and the bill comes due. You may think that metabolically you're avoiding the worst of it, but it's happening.
It's so common too, these elevated triglycerides. And most docs, unless they go to these conferences, they don't know to look at that because, you know, there's phenofibrates and they don't have a really good drug class, you know, that doesn't have a lot of side effects to address it. So they're like, well, you might want to exercise more or go in a low
but any physician, any conventional physician, and I do try to say this with nothing but respect, they don't put a lot of credence into lifestyle, partly because I'm sure they have tried to get healthy in the past, and they look at this kind of low-fat, low-calorie type diet and think, it never really worked for me. And so they sort of say it, but that's the only thing they can say, right? Because if they're going to send them down the hall to the diabetic nutrition counseling, it's going to be low-fat, high-carb diets, even for their diabetics, let alone the people that are overweight or have hypertension. So the average physician probably just lacks conviction because they've not really seen anything work for them. But they also just don't have the information. And that is, both of those are very forgivable, and we should have nothing but compassion. A physician is just like everyone else. They only know what they've been taught or what they've taught themselves. And a physician doesn't get paid to ask questions like that. And that sounds insulting, but I don't mean for it to. It's just basic economics. A physician gets paid to see patients. I'm a scientist. I get paid to ask questions. I get paid to be curious. And so I can afford, I have the time, because that's how I get compensated. If I'm not teaching on any given day and I don't have any obligations, I could literally sit in my office, look out the window, and just say, what's the optimal triglyceride to HDL ratio, for example, as a marker of metabolic health? And I can find an answer to it. And to my great delight, if there's not an answer to some of these questions, I then ask myself, can I answer the question? Can I, in my own lab, with my resources, can I be the primary source of the answer? And that's sort of how I split it up. I look at, when I'm giving a talk, always my talks can be broken up into 2 categories. It's a primary source talk where I know these data because they're mine from my own lab, or it's a secondary source, which is I'm presenting information like the whole insulin to glucagon ratio that I spoke about a couple years ago. That was not my data. Those were data from a guy named Roger Unger and others, so it was secondary source, and everyone has access to that, including a physician. But again, to kind of wrap that idea up, a physician shouldn't be expected to know all of this stuff. Just like I don't know everything a physician knows, but more and more as this sort of medium is growing, it's gratifying to think there's someone listening to this who may either be a physician or is a patient about to speak with their physician, and they can go in armed and hopefully with knowledge, not to fight, But hopefully the physician is going to be humble enough to acknowledge the source, that the patient is informed, and then act accordingly. Like a patient saying, I want to get my insulin measured. Often a physician will say, well, we don't need to. We measured your glucose, and we know your glucose is normal. The patient can then help the physician know, no, these are not the same things, and they're not always going to be coupled. It's not that low glucose means low insulin. That's part of the problem with insulin resistance, not to change the subject. But by looking at it as a glucose disease, we don't detect it because it's an insulin disease, not a glucose disease.
So do you recommend everyone test insulin?
I do, yeah.
If you're getting labs done anyway, might as well throw it on.
I think so, yeah. And more, it is easy to do. And more, from what I understand, insurances cover it. Like United Health Group, the world's largest insurance company or insurer, they are doing that more. And I've had direct conversations with them. So this is happening. This awareness of insulin is growing, and I couldn't be happier because I do believe it's one of the missing links when we look at chronic disease, how to detect problems, how to treat them. Because, like for example, in the context of type 2 diabetes, if we just look at it as a glucose disease, we neither acknowledge that the insulin is already elevated, nor do we care that we're going to bump it even higher with insulin therapy or drugs that force the beta cells to make more insulin. But if we just look at it as a glucose problem, the glucose is climbing, we say, oh, well, who cares if we bump up the insulin even more? We lower the glucose. And it does lower the glucose. And if that's the only outcome we care about, well, then we did it. But when we acknowledge the whole of human health, by bumping the insulin up even higher in the type 2 diabetic, they are twice as likely to die from cancer, and they're 3 times more likely to die from heart disease, and twice double the risk of Alzheimer's death as well. I mean, so we kill them faster and we make them fatter. Within about 6 months, they often will gain about 20 pounds once they begin insulin therapy. That should give any health practitioner pause. And the next time they're meeting with a type 2 diabetic, they, one, should measure the insulin and then think to themselves, is it really worth trying to get perfect glucose right now by forcing the insulin even higher? No, it never is. I'll answer that question. But when we look at it as an insulin problem, we then take a step back and say, how can I lower the insulin? And that very logically leads to this idea of, well, what's keeping the insulin high? Well, it's all the carbohydrates, because we tell you to eat a high-carb diet and we tell you to eat 6 times a day. That is a perfect way to make sure that insulin is elevated every waking moment of the day. And like I mentioned earlier, too much insulin is a cause of insulin resistance. So the health practitioner can say, let's lower the insulin by controlling the carbs coming in. And that to me is rule number 1.
I love that. I want to unpack a few things here, but is insulin still commonly prescribed for type 2 diabetes?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, to me, that seems like if you're a licensed healthcare practitioner in the United States of America and you're prescribing insulin, that to me seems like, whoa. Do you not have an internet connection?
It is absolutely the most common source of insulin prescriptions, even now. I mean, you only need insulin if you're a type 1 diabetic, a true type 1, and it's confirmed type 1. And it's not like MODY or another type of diabetes that acts like type 1. Mm-hmm. But with type 2, yes. I don't know the order. You almost always, the first drug is Metformin, and more it's a GLP-1 agonist. And that's an interesting drug class because GLP-1 is a so-called insulin secretagogue, so it does induce insulin release. But what's so interesting about it, by mimicking glucagon, it also stimulates brown fat activation. And so there's this kind of metabolic offset that potentially, offsets some of the negative effects of bumping the insulin higher. But nevertheless, insulin therapy is, I'm quite certain, step number 3, if not number 2. Metformin's almost always first, and justifiably, the side effects are pretty minimal, and it does directly improve insulin sensitivity without increasing insulin. So it works in that regard. Although I do think it's being overused. Nowadays people are talking about metformin
for longevity. And
Yep. And there's some considerations there that I don't think enough people are acknowledging. But nevertheless, insulin is still very widely prescribed to type 2 diabetics, and it is just a manifestation of our glucocentric, dare I say, glucose-obsessed perspective on diabetes and even health in general.
Yeah. But you'd be okay with GLP-1 outside the fact that it's kind of whipping the pancreas a little bit, kind of like the sulfonylureas where they exacerbate. So it's, you're kind of helping one problem, but you're still kind of affecting that beta cell.
Yeah, so I think GLP-1 agonists are the only option if you wanted to look at an insulin secretagogue, which I think should only be used, and you mentioned sulfonylureas, and they're the more common at least classically, although GLP-1 agonists are getting more common now. But if someone is genuinely insulin deficient, which can happen in some states of type 2 diabetes, but it is not common, overwhelmingly in type 2 diabetes, people, but they use kind of clever language. They'll say insulin is insufficient to control glucose, and that implies that it's too low. The reality is it is always higher than the average person and always higher than a normal range, whatever that means. No one really defines it. I have my own definition, but it's always elevated, insulin is. So even a GLP-1 agonist, I believe that it should not be used, even though it's somewhat offset because of the nature of the molecule and kind of mimicking glucagon in some of its metabolically friendly aspects. We should always first question, once we confirm the insulin is elevated, immediately just say, cut the carbs. And that really was the beginning of my awakening as an academic, as a scientist, was looking at health through the lens of insulin and just finding more and more insulin resistance was, one, not only incredibly common, but two, relevant to every chronic disease, either explicitly causing it or just exacerbating it. The more I saw the relevance of insulin resistance, the more I looked into the causes and acknowledging that elevated insulin, chronically bumping up insulin, is driving insulin resistance. At least that's part of the metabolic storm causing it. Then it was simply me honestly asking, how do we lower insulin the best? And the best way is cutting carbs. There can be no debate. As much as people want to say, go on a low-fat vegan diet, yeah, frankly, if you're going from a standard American diet, that's going to help, right? Any step away from the standard American diet is going to be a good step. Even, heaven forbid, even vegan, low-fat vegan. That'll help the insulin sensitivity, at least in the short term, although it will cause other problems long term. But I had to admit, controlling carbs is the best way to do it. And that was honest to goodness, was a painful transition for me, because like I said, I had been as much an advocate as low-fat calorie counting as anyone, and even more of an advocate of being careful with saturated fats, because my whole fellowship was, my postdoctoral fellowship work was looking at how the saturated fat palmitate can cause insulin resistance. And so that was as much a part of my, that conviction I had was extreme, just avoid saturated fat, because I'm seeing, as we are infusing saturated fat into animals and as we are treating muscle cells or liver cells with saturated fat, they become insulin resistant. But when we would put on oleic acid, 18-1, it would offset it. It would actually get it back to normal. And there's a lot of nuance there, right? One, these were both fake models. Neither of these models are a human eating saturated fat. So it doesn't account for the complexity of a whole organism, because that it does start to fall apart. And we have ample human evidence now to show that if it's a low-carb diet, even though they're eating 3 times more saturated fat, the actual amount of free fatty acids, saturated fat in the blood, is significantly down. But it's also reflective of this with the rodent model and the cell model. We mitigated the negativity of the saturated fat by putting in an unsaturated fat. And in nature, at least with the animal fats, you always have a mix. You always have a mix of fats, from saturated to monounsaturated to polyunsaturated. There is a broad mix of fats, all of which are this orchestra of nutrition, I would argue, offsetting what we see in these very artificial situations where we're just putting in one single saturated fat at admittedly very high levels, and we see what happens. That's fake. That's not real. And it was kind of me remembering, wait a minute, I'm a physiologist. I need to consider the whole body. I need to consider the whole process of the consumption down to what's happening when this molecule gets to the cell. And like I said, that was the kind of loss of innocence, and me embracing the efficacy of a low-carb diet, which I never would have imagined that I would.
Fascinating.
But I couldn't deny the data.
Totally. And it's that data that a lot of vegans use to support their hypothesis that, hey, look, when animals eat this diet, then these fats cause insulin resistance, and then the ceramide deposition, and I mean, not to mention any names, but there's quite a few
Yes.
popular vegan YouTubers that
Yes.
highlight these animal model studies, and they need to re-listen to what you just said, which is
What they do, they base that kind of statement on on that ounce of truth, like the data that I just showed, very possibly even citing my own studies on this when they invoke this fear of saturated fats. But it fails to acknowledge the complexity of the whole organism, and to cite specific data. So one, saturated fat, you mentioned ceramides, and I love that you did. Ceramides are a type of fat, one of the hundreds of thousands of types of fat in every cell. It is such a massive family of molecules. Ceramides are, I would argue, the most relevant of all of them when it comes to directly antagonizing insulin signaling. So if ceramides are accumulating in a cell, ceramides are blocking insulin's effects. So back to my analogy of insulin knocking on the door and a kid running to the door to answer the door. It's like one sibling trips the kid up on the way. And as happens in my home all the time, they start fighting, and so no one answers the door. Ceramides initiate that fight, so to speak, and they block the cell from responding to insulin like it normally would. Ceramides are built, there are sort of two pieces to that recipe of ceramides being made. One is palmitate, the most prevalent, the most abundant saturated fat. Of course, as an aside, we know that palmitate is made by the liver very, very readily anytime insulin is high. And so that's how you can be on a like no fat diet. And if you're spiking your insulin, you've got loads of palmitate in your blood ready to go anywhere anywhere it wants to go. So one, you have to have the saturated fat palmitate. Two, you have to have an inflammatory signal. This so-called inflammation cascade is necessary to take that palmitate and sort of shunt it into this pathway of ceramide biosynthesis and then ultimate accumulation. Both of those variables are down on a low-carb diet. The saturated fats are down in the blood. That was published. And inflammation is down in these instances on someone adhering to a low-carb diet compared to a standard diet. And insulin always lowers more on a low-carb diet than any intervention. Like, it's possible you could have someone go into a vegan diet and inflammation might get better, although likely not, frankly, if they're depending on what they're eating. But saturated fat goes down on a low-carb diet. Inflammation goes down. This is confirmed. These are published data. We've eliminated the two components of the recipe for making ceramides, which are the main antagonist to insulin, or basically the main driver of insulin resistance at the cellular level.
It's fat induced, but it's through an inflammatory mechanism.
Yeah. Yep. Inflammation basically initiates the process. Inflammation comes to the cell and pulls palmitate, pulls actually the amino acid serine, and pumps them together, and that creates the backbone of all ceramides.
If we have time, I want to go back to athletes and fatty muscle and differentiate that between obesity. We have so much to unpack here, and I think I don't want to get too off topic, but it's really fascinating about the palmitate. I have some friends that look at red blood cell EPA and DHA to look at the fatty acids, and also look at the palmitate to get another proxy of insulin sensitivity and that de novo lipid synthesis. Have you ever looked at some of that data?
No, I've not. I'm familiar with the data implicating palmitate as a marker of de novo lipogenesis at the liver, but I'm not familiar with scrutinizing EPA and DHA to look at kind of cell function. The upside of doing that, I know, is EPA and DHA are essential fats. If we have them, we've eaten them, and so looking at those levels give an indication of nutritional status. And that's, Mike, at the risk of kind of going on a tangent, EPA and DHA are the essential omega-3 polyunsaturated fats. We have the kind of flax-derived version of the omega-3s in chia, so some seeds, is the alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, and its ability to convert into DHA and EPA is very, very low, which is part of the kind of the vegan problem that a vegan has to counter somehow. Because if they say, well, I'm getting my omega-3s, I'm getting them from these seeds, I'm not saying those omega-3s are bad from like milled flax or milled chia, or not even milled, just soaked and consumed. But they won't convert into the biologically relevant forms. But what is so interesting about ALA is that it is the most oxidized and thus the most ketogenic of all the fats. And even in the brain, Stephen Cunnane, anyone curious about this, look up the work by Stephen Cunnane, and he outlines and describes the role of ALA as an omega-3 for the brain because of how rapidly it converts to ketones and providing a very ample fuel for the brain.
Interesting. So it's almost MCT-like in the sense that it's very ketogenic.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, if you look at all the long-chain fats, it's the number one most oxidized. So it burns, if we say that, burns faster than any of the other long-chain fats. Now, I like that you brought up MCT. The shorter the fat gets, the more readily it's burned. So MCTs will burn more readily than long-chain fats. Indeed, MCTs probably burn faster than ALA, although I don't know that comparison. And then short-chain fats will burn faster than medium-chain fats because medium-chain fats has a very modest capacity for storage. Like you can actually incorporate some medium-chain fats into lipid droplets. But again, very little. And I don't believe that's possible at all for the short-chain fats. I've never seen a single speck of data to support that. But nevertheless, ALA, the omega-3 that we kind of treat like a redheaded stepchild, it does actually, I think, deserve a little more respect, even in the low-carb space where we are all justifiably wary of seed fats. When we're talking about flax and chia, most especially, and I'm not talking about flax oil or chia oil, I'm talking about, like sometimes I'll make a pudding out of chia seed in the family, or adding grilled milled flaxseed to a shake or something, or the crepe mix that I make for my kids. I think there's a place for that in the diet, especially for kids, where we know they need ketones for brain development.
So whole food, not refined oil.
That's it.
For those.
Yep.
That's a really important distinction because I think people, they hear, people hear PUFAs, so they think, okay, canola oil is the same as fish. Someone, a carnivore person the other day said, all cold water fish should never be eaten.
Oh, that's
crazy.
Are
you kidding me?
That's crazy.
Really? What did North Americans eat? No one fished?
That's crazy.
Anyway, so I thought, because there, again, it's kind of obfuscating or confusing canola oil with fish. And
that's really unfortunate. And even to invoke Stephen Cunnane again and his work on the brain, it really is compelling. Anyone listening to this, go look up the work of Stephen Cunnane, get his book, Survival of the Fattest. It is so interesting. But the idea of us claiming that fish is unhealthy, that's ridiculous. And it goes right against a lot of his work and his contention that humans developed on a shore-based diet, what he calls a shore-based diet, very rich in omega-3s, because we're eating foods along a shore, fish and clams and stuff. Rich in omega-3s and rich in iodine. And I'm going to put on my dad hat for a moment. Those are actually so what I give my kids every day, the only supplements I worry about with my kids, omega-3s, iodine, and then lastly, vitamin D. Vitamin D3 in particular, although it's summer and I encourage them to get out, but even still. But with the iodine, one problem of all these really sexy gourmet salts that we're all eating now, and where heaven forbid we actually have a box of Morton's salt. I worry that we're not getting enough iodine. I mean, the thing about conventional old-fashioned table salt, the Morton's salt, for example, in the little blue boxes, it's all iodinized. They added iodine because it is so common not to have enough iodine. And speaking of brain function, you have to have ample thyroid hormone to foster normal brain function. The consequences of a developing child, let alone fetus, of insufficient thyroid hormone, the mental consequences are just catastrophic and never can be made up. Never. And so iodine is one thing I make sure I get my kids, because I do like these salts. I'm good friends with the guys who run Redmond Real Salt here in Utah. I love the salt and use it all the time. But I don't eat a shore-based diet. And so while I'm confident I'm getting a lot of minerals and micronutrients from the salt, I'm not getting the iodine. Anyway, I've gone off on a huge tangent.
No, it's really important.
But it's all sort of part of this kind of idea of brain health.
Which is amazing. I love that you brought that up. We don't talk too much about that, and it's important that people hear that over and over again.
Yeah.
Iodine's big in my household as well. I mean, for women too. I mean, you talk a lot in the book about PCOS and fibrocystic breast disease, things like that. Iodine is really big for female hormone health and all that. But let's kind of get back a little bit to insulin.
Perfect.
You talked about eating every 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah.
So is it this? So let's say a lot of people are doing intermittent fasting.
Yep.
So if you were to do high carb intermittent fasting, do you think you would have hyperinsulinemia? Because you kind of talked about in the book that it's not only that you have the carbs, but it's every couple hours.
Yeah.
So it's like you're raising it all the time. Is that kind of the problem?
Yeah, I believe it is. Yeah, so I am an advocate of fasting. I think it is tremendously effective. And I really credit Jason Fung, and I just have to mention him just because I think that he's being forgotten about in some circles, but he was, as far as I know, he was the birth of the modern focus on fasting. I'm unaware of anyone talking about it before him, at least as loudly as he was. So we have to acknowledge his role in this focus on fasting. It is incredibly therapeutic. And when someone engages in fasting, if they're coming into this as a type 2 diabetic, insulin dependent, they're going to have to start cutting their insulin dose really quickly because the efficacy is so remarkable in improving insulin sensitivity. But again, no one will do that until they talk to their doctor, of course. But yeah, if someone, like, let's imagine a scenario where someone's doing one meal a day. They basically are fasting for 22 hours, 23 hours, and literally only eating in, like, let's say a 1 hour window. I think they could get away with a lot of abuse, to be honest, dietary, in the context of diet, where it would engage. I think it's an unhealthy habit, so I'm not at all encouraging it or advocating it in the least. But if someone did that and they would, in that 1 hour, let's say, in that one meal, eat a diet that that was 60% carbs, but even if it was kind of moderately whole food, they'd probably be fine, frankly, with regards to just insulin sensitivity. However, I will counter that by saying, I know people who do one meal a day, and I've seen the tendency in myself where I eat that one meal and I eat way more than I should have. Yeah. And now I'm carrying that around with me all evening. And when I go to bed and I track my sleep, my heart rate stays elevated higher, my breathing rate stays elevated higher. My body's trying to settle down, and yet it's working like gangbusters trying to digest this lump of food just sitting in my gut. I think that one meal a day can... I worry in some people, although many people can do it wonderfully well. In some people, I worry that it's just become a surrogate for like a binge purge cycle, and it can be abused. But back to your example of it, if someone did it and it was high carb, but I would say still kind of as natural as possible, even, for heaven forbid, whole grains, fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables I give more of a green light to than grains, because immediately you're processing it, you're baking it, you're changing it at that point. But if someone did that and it was just one meal, yeah, the insulin would climb up. It would take about 3 hours to come down, depending on the person. That's a long time to stay in a low insulin state, and insulin sensitivity would probably be all right.
So it's more that chronically elevated insulin. That's the issue, because it's like the kid's always yelling at mom. It's just mom has selective hearing.
Yeah. Well, in fact, in my lab, when we induced insulin resistance in animals, one little dose of insulin wasn't enough. We had to keep doing it. We had to keep giving them the insulin. We had to be bumping it up in order to induce insulin resistance. So I would rely on even my own data to say that, yeah, one insulin spike in a day, you're going to be all right.
Interesting. And so let's tie that back into this calories in, calories out model, because a lot of people are focused on my metabolism. I have a slow metabolism, they say. I'm using air quotes. What is insulin doing to their metabolic rate?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. That's a great question. And it's a question I've thought a lot about, because I have more and more, I'm coming from a background of training that focused exclusively on calorie number, that it was just pure thermodynamics, including through my PhD in bioenergetics, which is how the body uses energy. So I very much appreciate thermodynamics. But it was this self-awakening, appreciating that hormones matter. And I was never taught that I had to learn that all myself and then see my own data to really believe it and have the, I would say, well-rounded perspective on the relevance of hormones that I do now. But I believe that accounting for hormones allows us to account for thermodynamics. And very specifically, insulin slows metabolic rate. This has been known since the very beginning, the early 1900s, where we have some of the most famous physiologists, if there are any physiologists that are famous. Jocelyn, who was a famous endocrinologist, and then Benedict, who was a famous metabolic rate scientist. And we still rely on the Benedict equation to predict metabolic rate in people till this day. they found that when that there was this mismatch in metabolic rate in severe diabetes, that when they looked at a type 1 diabetic who was untreated with insulin, so no insulin, their metabolic rate was about 300 calories higher than it should be based on their size. And size largely dictates metabolic rate. So you mentioned this, one of the myths of my buddies who were overweight from our childhood now, that are now overweight, and they'll say, oh, my metabolic weight just slowed down when I got married. And I look at them and he's double my weight, and I'll say, no, your metabolic rate is way higher than mine. If there's more body, there's more metabolic rate. There's more work going on in the body. So metabolic rate is not, people shouldn't be blaming metabolic rate, is what I'm saying. So these data of the type 1 diabetic, it becomes even more extreme when you actually give the type 1 diabetic insulin. And a follow-up, I call it a follow-up, in the 1980s, they looked at the shift in metabolic rate in an untreated type 1 diabetic to insulin therapy. And so insulin now going up, suddenly being in the body, metabolic rate slowed about 300 calories a day the moment they started insulin therapy. And the same thing happens in type 2 diabetics, where they have insulin here, you bump it up even higher, metabolic rate slows. So hormones dictate energy use in the body. And that, to me, allows us to encompass both of these seemingly opposite or seemingly contrasting philosophies on obesity, that it's purely a caloric phenomenon or it's purely an endocrine phenomenon. My sentiment is it's both. Without a doubt, calorie number matters. Absolutely it does. But hormones also matter insofar as hormones tell the cell and the body by extension what to do with energy, what to do with the glucose and the fats that are coming, the amino acids even, what to do with those nutrients, and the rate at which it's doing it, which spills into this metabolic rate realm. Because metabolic rate, as we detected in the body, is the sum of every chemical reaction happening in the body. That is metabolism, the balance of anabolic reactions and catabolic reactions. Insulin slows it down. Something like ketones speed it up. And we have data to support that idea, although ketones are not a hormone, but ketones are influenced by hormones, and so it still falls under this, and specifically insulin. It falls under this, what I like to think of as a kind of cohesive paradigm of human obesity. It is a caloric phenomenon, but it needs to be considered in the context of hormones, because hormones dictate energy use.
It's fascinating. I want to drill down in specifically about the mitochondria, but before we kind of transition to that, because I'll forget, how insulin affects the fat tissue. And we kind of did a quick little podcast about this. And since that talk you gave at Metabolic Health Summit in January of this year, you showed some fascinating images. And I went and looked at them and injection sites of insulin. And in fact, it's pretty funny. You'll think it's interesting. So I shared one of these on Instagram, and it got flagged for like nudity because it was someone's abdomen that looked like a rear end. So talk about how insulin affects fat cells.
Yeah, I think I know the exact picture you're talking about. Yeah, so in fact, it's funny, that picture, I think you're talking about this man with these kind of two lumps hanging down his belly. Mm-hmm. I show that in my class as a teacher, and I crop out the top part, and so it does look like some bum cheeks. But anyway, one of the ways I keep the class engaged, Mike, these kind of childish attempts at humor.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so at the sites, so an insulin-treated diabetic creates another important model here to look at how powerful insulin is at the fat cell. And in these insulin injection sites, the reason we tell any diabetic to rotate their injection sites is to prevent the excessive growth of the fat cells. We learned this early on in the biomedical community. Constant injections of insulin into one site results in fat cells growing 3 to 5 times bigger than neighboring fat cells. So there's this exaggerated lipohypertrophy, or the growth of the individual cell. The cells are getting really big, and we can detect this. You take a fat biopsy and then slice it and look at it under a microscope. Like I said, the cells are 3 to 5 times bigger at the sites that are getting insulin. You go a few inches over from the insulin injection, they're perfectly normal sized. So insulin tells a fat cell to grow, and it does that very well by partly altering the mitochondria. Insulin will slow the metabolic rate in certain fat cells, whereas ketones, like I mentioned, accelerate the metabolic rate.
Now, someone might say, well, that's super physiologic levels of insulin, that's localized. I mean, is it achievable or plausible that if you're eating a standard American diet, snacking every 2-3 hours like we're told, that could then cause enlargement of other subcutaneous fat?
Yeah. So what I say to that idea, and it's one I've thought about, I speculate a little here, but what we see in a concentrated dose of insulin at one injection site with that exaggerated growth of fat cells, as we imagine the whole body swimming in a sea of higher insulin, admittedly maybe not quite as high as the insulin injection is, but nevertheless elevated, we can very reasonably suspect that all fat cells in the body are experiencing that same signal to grow, just not quite as dramatic as that one specific site of insulin injection. So it's basically like we're just spreading it out throughout the body. That I believe matters because as we are inducing hyperinsulinemia chronically everywhere, the growth of our fat cells is only one of many concerns. We then, and I elaborate this in the book, but we got to start looking at the brain health, gonad health, liver health, and more.
So maybe if we could just finish off with that thought that you were saying that that the growth of fat cells is only one problem.
Yeah. So looking at insulin only in the context of a fat cell is really selling insulin short. Insulin, like I mentioned at the outset of our discussion, every cell in the body has insulin receptors, and some of these cells are becoming insulin resistant as a way to almost survive. You know, like when a fat cell starts to become insulin resistant, it is, if we kind of assign some human ideas to it, the fat cell is basically saying, I'm too big. I can't get bigger. It's already kind of reached maximal dimensions, and it becomes insulin resistant in order to survive. Other cells don't have that ability. Like, for example, ovaries. We know that insulin will inhibit this enzyme that converts androgens into estrogens. So there's an important step, and it's only one single step, of going from testosterone, converting the testosterone into the family of estrogens, because estrogen is sort of a catch-all term for all the female hormones, the sex hormones that are higher in females. That one step is mediated by an enzyme called aromatase. The ovaries, seeing all that insulin inhibits aromatase in the ovaries. That doesn't become insulin resistant. It continues to operate. Insulin maintains that perfect sensitivity at inhibiting aromatase. So what we have in the woman who's experiencing chronic hyperinsulinemia, she may not be overtly overweight or obese, but that high level of insulin, kind of touching on your point earlier of thin on the outside, fat on the inside, they might not look like they should have polycystic ovarian syndrome, but they get it. The woman gets it because of her chronically elevated insulin. Insulin directly inhibits the ovary's ability to convert androgens like testosterone into estrogens. And that's how it always happens. Every estrogen in every human's body was once an androgen that was just converted. That's the natural process of creating these sex hormones. Men simply just use less of it. We don't have as much aromatase in our gonads, and so we have more androgens. Women have more aromatase, so they have relatively than men, relative to men, more estrogens. Insulin blocks that from happening. So now we have a woman who can't get that estrogen spike, that estradiol spike in her menstrual cycle to facilitate an actual ovulation of an egg from an ovary. You have to have that estrogen spike. You don't get it in this disease because insulin doesn't let it happen. And so this poor woman, she has her ovaries that are getting lots of eggs every month. One must ovulate for the others to shrink and go away. By not ovulating one of those eggs, they all stay. And then the other month comes around and more eggs come. And they eventually, these are kind of cysts, they're fluid-filled little sacs. But her ovaries can get multiples bigger than normal, creating incredible discomfort in the poor woman, not to mention all the other consequences that are coming as a result of the insulin, like the acne and even the hair loss that she starts to see. That's actually derivative of the testosterone as well. But it's insulin matters far more than just fat cells. It's basically every organ is going to in some way be affected by insulin levels being too high.
It's crazy. I mean, I love to talk about fat cells, but I know people want to talk about fertility. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, the PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. So insulin is kind of, if we look at root cause, hyperinsulinemia is at the root of polycystic ovarian.
Yes, I'm unaware of any instance where that isn't the case. And that is why over 90% of all women with PCOS respond so favorably to metformin, this insulin sensitizing drug. I'm not an advocate of any drugs, really, ever. Well, that's not fair to say. Drugs won't solve a problem. Right. They will treat a symptom. And in the case of insulin resistance, metformin is, I believe, the best. If you improve a woman's insulin sensitivity, the PCOS starts to immediately get better because it is a disease of too much insulin. But if we then switch and look at men, the most common form of infertility in men nowadays is erectile dysfunction. That demands normal vasodilation. We must have capillaries that can expand and increase blood flow for male fertility. So this is a bit of a shift here now, but insulin actually facilitates vasodilation by getting sensed at the endothelial cells, the cells that are lining the blood vessel, the single little cell, the single layer of cells. Insulin will come to an endothelial cell and induce the production of a molecule called nitric oxide. And everyone who's in the health industry knows nitric oxide will induce vasodilation. That's why if someone's having chest pains, we give them a nitroglycerin pill under their tongue. It will get brought into the body, metabolized into nitric oxide, and the vessels will dilate and increase blood flow and alleviate the symptoms of this chest pain. In erectile dysfunction, these capillaries have become insulin resistant. And now insulin comes to the endothelial cells and it cannot make as much nitric oxide to induce the vasodilation, which is necessary again for male fertility. But that's different. So male fertility, most common problem, erectile dysfunction, is dependent on insulin resistance, whereas female infertility, most common PCOS, is dependent on the hyperinsulinemia. What is tragic, those two always come together. You cannot have insulin resistance without hyperinsulinemia. Those two are essential, the two pillars of the disease. To say insulin resistance is to say hyperinsulinemia. And anyone who attempts to tease those two apart is no longer talking about insulin resistance. They're talking about something else that might have some hint of insulin resistance because they're looking at glucose levels, for example, and glucose responses in the blood to carbohydrate in the diet. But if they tease out, if they say, well, it's insulin resistance but low insulin, no, it doesn't happen. I'm unaware of a single instance where that can happen.
So it's not just semantics. We need to really start using that term.
Yep.
Hyperinsulinemia, not just insulin. Okay.
Yep, they go together.
That's good. Good for people to realize that and understand that. Do you recommend testing postprandial insulin or fasting? Sorry, I know we talked about that long time ago.
No. If someone can measure postprandial insulin, that is absolute gold standard. And there are two ways to do that. There's the Kraft assay, which has gained a lot of attention. Then there is I think it's Hiyashi assay. I kind of actually like the Hiyashi assay just because it's 3 time point. Well, 4. Fasting level, and then 30-minute, 60-minute, 90-minute. And the beauty of it is it's still very predictive of insulin resistance, and it's just simply looking at the curves. And I elaborate this in the book with a very pretty little figure. But basically, if the person has their insulin peak at 30 minutes and then it comes down, so it's a slope that's kind of looking like that, time point 0, 30-minute, 60-minute, 90-minute, good. That's normal. If it goes 0, 30-minute, 60-minute, then 90-minute, that's probably a problem. The person is probably insulin resistant. Or on the extreme end, if it's 0, 30, 60, 90, and the peak is at 90 minutes, boom, done, insulin resistance confirmed. So it's a very simple but still very predictive method. But I don't really harp on that postprandial insulin assay because no one can ever get it done. It doesn't happen. No one
logistically it's hard.
We just don't do it.
Yeah.
We just don't do it in a clinical setting. And really the only way you can do this is in an academic setting. So I choose to rely on the triglyceride to HDL ratio and fasting insulin. Fasting insulin isn't as good as postprandial, but it's really the only option, practically speaking.
Yeah, that came to mind, so I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah.
What about hyperinsulinemia in the brain? I know you're and that paper that you're working on publishing with the genetics. I think that'd be interesting to talk about that. as well.
Yeah, I'd love to dive into it. So I'll preface this by saying these are pre-published data, so we haven't published it yet. We're just about to. But what we found, we had this opportunity to collaborate with a genomics lab. And this lab happened to be studying Alzheimer's disease, but looking at nothing nutrient metabolism related at all. I reached out to him and said, hey, here is a list. So I kind of presented the justification for this project, which is evidence is mounting that in the earliest stages of Alzheimer's disease, even decades before the disease is detected clinically, we can detect a brain glucose hypometabolism. So this idea of tracking glucose use into the brain and finding out that it's compromised. And this is actually reflected across multiple neurological disorders, Alzheimer's, migraines, epilepsy, to name, I guess, the main three. But in Alzheimer's disease, I presented this context. It's this a nutrient, an energy deficit in the brain. And so I sent him this list. Here are the main genes involved in glucose uptake and glucose breakdown. So glycolysis, this whole family of genes. I think we ended up looking at about 20 or 30 of them. And then I wanted to compare that across the healthy brain and the brain with Alzheimer's disease. And these are human. These are postmortem brain samples. Then we looked at the ketolytic. So ketone uptake, because there are, of course, actually they're called MCTs, funnily enough, these monocarboxylate transporters. So ketone transporters, if you will, and then the genes involved in ketone breakdown. It is shocking. Again, this is pre-published data now, so we'll see how the ultimate publication plays out. But every single gene in the demented brain of glucose uptake and glycolysis was significantly lower than the healthy brain. In contrast, of the 15 to 20 genes we looked at with regards to ketolysis, so ketone uptake and ketone breakdown, only one was significantly compromised in the demented brains compared to the normal. All the rest of those genes were totally normal. This is such a powerful support for this idea that to really understand Alzheimer's disease, we have to acknowledge its metabolic roots and acknowledge, in so doing, acknowledge that the best way to treat it isn't going to be trying to attack some nerve tangle or trying to attack some amyloid plaque. It's going to be addressing the energy deficit, and we see this. You've seen the studies. You can take someone with full-blown Alzheimer's disease, put them into ketosis rapidly through exogenous ketones, and in real time detect improvements in cognition. It doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't cure the disease, but it is very provocative to think, what could we have done to help that person decades ago if we'd given the brain a break and let it eat ketones? But that's part of the problem in our environment, Mike, where everyone's eating every 2 hours these starchy, sugary foods. Every waking moment is spent in a period of elevated insulin, and insulin inhibits ketone production more than anything else does. So the brain, in its most active, demanding moments during the day when we're alert and communicating and living, it doesn't have any access to ketones. So it's swimming in a sea of glucose and starving because it just can't use it. And it's just sort of crying out, give me an alternative fuel, please. And the average person never gives the brain a break because their insulin won't let the ketones come and save the day.
So if you could speculate and hypothesize that would be the root cause, is hyperinsulinemia is causing an energetic deficit within the brain cells?
Yeah. So we know that brain cells have insulin-dependent glucose transporters. There is one other class there too that is insulin-independent, but at least some of the glucose coming into the brain depends on insulin coming and signaling the door to open, if you will. The door opens and now glucose can come in. As the brain becomes progressively insulin resistant, that aspect is compromised. So there's at least some of the glucose that should be getting in can't now. And that is why so many refer to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes. I don't love that name, actually. I think it is simply derivative of insulin resistance, just like type 2, so it should just be called type 2 diabetes, but now it's affecting the brain. But nevertheless, what I do like in that term is that it evokes this idea of this being a metabolic problem, because it really does seem to be.
There's a few studies of intranasal insulin, and so it seems that can improve cognitive function. So you're kind of overriding that insulin resistance by just driving it into the nose.
That's right. Yeah, but I actually am very wary of that. We started a study, and we never followed up on it because it was just a difficult model. What I wanted to do in that study, this was actually explore the use of intranasal insulin. So the idea is anyone listening, that the person is inhaling the insulin, like almost like a little thing they'd breathe into to open their nasal passages, they're breathing in a shot of insulin. Those epithelial cells never see insulin. And what I wanted to study was what is the effect of this huge shot of insulin hitting the epithelial cells lining the top of the nasal cavity, which should never see insulin. Insulin, that is totally unnatural. Now, thank heavens, enough of it's getting absorbed into the blood and going up and having an effect that we want. But I can't help but wonder what is going to be the off-target negative effect of lining the epithelium with all that insulin. Is it going to foster growth? Are we asking for some
GBM.
tumor in the epithelium where we're stimulating this rampant growth, potentially activating all these growth pathways in cells that never see that kind of insulin? So there may be a downside to this.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like an interesting proof of concept study that hey, type 3 diabetes really exists. But yeah, I would not recommend a family member go on intranasal insulin. I mean, at all. We kind of, you've talked a lot about hypertension in the book, so I think we'll leave that with the aldosterone and renin system. I think is fascinating. But the energetic shift in the heart is kind of similar to the brain, is it not? I mean, I've seen a lot of studies about how the heart tends to, in the failing heart, I think as the title of one of the papers, uses ketones. That's crazy.
You're exactly right. Yeah, that is almost explicitly one of the titles. Does the failing heart rely on ketones? We don't know yet. So what we do know, we know that the failing heart is using more ketone for fuel. We don't know whether that's because it's attempting to try to rescue itself, or whether it's just a sort of artifact. It's just the heart, it can't rely on anything else, and ketones are the only thing there. But even that, I'd submit is not a bad reason to focus on ketones. We do know that molecule for molecule, kind of calorie for calorie, ketones induce greater contractility of the heart. And in heart failure, that is the problem. The heart is not sufficiently contracting to eject all of its blood. The heart, normally if we look at the big ventricles, especially left ventricle, it's supposed to contract completely and push every speck of blood out and then fill back up as water starts dripping back or blood starts coming back from the atrium above it. What happens in heart failure is it can't close all the way, and so it doesn't move the blood, so it's chronically kind of congested with blood. Ketones induce a more forceful contraction. So I think we can pretty comfortably speculate that in the failing heart, it is shifting to ketones in order to try to improve its physiological function.
It's incredible.
Just like the brain is.
Now, signaling wise, that's fascinating. What is triggering that?
Isn't it? It's so compelling. Whether it's a redox change, whether it's some change in inflammatory, even signals within the heart, it could be something like what we see in the brain, and maybe this will be a follow-up study if we get enough heart tissue. Is there some inherent deficiency in glycolytic genes? Is it now, like the demented brain, trying to just rely on the only other fuel? Well, that's not, because the heart can readily use fatty acids for fuel too. But why is it even shunning fatty acids in favor of ketones? I don't know the answer.
It's interesting.
It's fascinating. All the more reason, though,
Yeah.
to just let the body have ketones,
Yeah.
which the average person never does. You know, they have, right when they'd be getting into the mildest state of ketosis, potentially after an overnight, just they're not eating, you know, maybe for 10 hours in the average person, or probably less in most people, right? Insulin has come down. It maybe took about 4 hours after their last meal or their last snack for the insulin to come. If that could stay low for another 8-10 hours, then they could start getting some ketones. But no, right around the time they'd start getting there, boom, they shut it all off with a bowl of cereal, a bagel, and a glass of orange juice.
It's a shame.
It is a shame. It really is. And that's, for me, it is always step number one. If someone wants to improve metabolic health, control carbs. I'm not saying don't eat any, just control them.
And people feel better. I mean, I was just speaking with a friend last night who I helped influence them to go on a ketogenic diet. They live in Idaho. They do a lot of skiing, a lot of backcountry, biking, mountain biking. They're like, I just love the freedom that I used to feel like on my mountain bike rides. I had a granola bar, and a goo in this. They're like, look, I have an espresso, a coffee. I'm out the door. I have food just in case if it's going to be a 50-miler, but I rarely have to dip into exogenous energy source. And so, I think we're all kind of taught that we need to have these things, and we revolve our life around food. But like you said, once you experience this and you start to get into a state of nutritional ketosis, it's so much more liberating. You don't have to.
I love what you said. This exogenous energy. I totally agree. It's one of the great tragedies. We often go hiking as a family. One of the hikes we'll do is a pretty popular hike, hiking to the Y. And you'll see when you come into Utah Valley, the big Y reflective of BYU. It's a very good, rigorous hike. It's steep uphill the whole way. I will see very overweight people with 2 bottles of Gatorade and 2 granola bars. And I'm looking at them thinking, how tragic. They're taking this because they say they need the energy, and they have hundreds of thousands of calories of energy on their body just waiting to be used. It's like every fat cell is like some small piece of an energy bar or an energy drink just waiting to be used. It's waiting there to be used. And the average person doesn't touch a speck of it because their insulin is too high to let them. Insulin has to be low for the fat cell to have a net kind of negative, if you will, where it's letting out more fat to be burned than it's taking in. Insulin has to be low for that to happen. And when someone has become adapted to that state of using fat for fuel and letting the brain eat ketones, they don't sense that kind of panicked hunger that they would otherwise feel. They can be hiking that and then go hours after that without even feeling the urge to eat because the body is nourished. Insulin being low is letting energy be used by all cells, not just being exaggeratedly taken up into fat cells or even muscle cells.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. The calorie counters of the world would say, well, it's not really about insulin. It's once you're in an energy deficit, that is what triggers the release of fat from fat tissue and all that. What would you say to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I look at hunger as 2 phases. And I'm not a hunger scientist, so I do say this with a little bit of just informed speculation. There's this sort of hedonistic or just satisfying aspect of hunger, which is very acute. Typically, this passes in about 12 to 16 hours of a fast, in my experience. But it's basically derived from the volume. It is something in my guts. Something was in my guts. Now it's not. I sense that kind of emptiness, and it's uncomfortable. It passes. And then essentially, like within a day, essentially the next phase of hunger is, am I truly running out of energy? Which, if you're obese, could be months. And I'm not advocating a multi-month fast, but it has been done under good supervision. But true, like the shift from a fast to starvation is what I believe is the same phase for real hunger, which is, have you run out of fat cells? As long as you have fat and that's feeding the body, you have energy. And again, I'm not encouraging some multi-month fast, but again, it has been done under clinical supervision. We know that the body is capable of this, and the people don't report hunger. They're just moving. They're just coasting in this state of being sort of detached from this sort of fleshly desire that they thought would overwhelm them because it was gnawing at them all the time. If the person has energy in fat cells to be used by the body, that is a fast. And then it's when the person starts to run out of fat, now they have to start cutting muscle to get those amino acids for gluconeogenesis, whereas the ketones from the fat was protecting the muscle. That's why we say ketones are muscle sparing, because if ketones are there, they can feed the brain enough to let the muscle keep all of its amino acids as protein. When ketones are becoming absent because of a loss of fat cells or fat tissue, then we got to start cutting into the muscle to pull those amino acids away to go to the liver to make new glucose, because now the glucose has to pick up the slack that the ketones were picking up. And so it's once you get to the point of losing fat mass, now we're cutting into muscle mass. Now we've gone into starvation, which should never be done. And that's when you have someone who's desperate enough to eat another human. That is the hunger. Point. Yep, that is the hunger that is insatiable. Like they will kill someone to a hunger that no one listening to this knows, because we live in such a blessed, privileged world, society, I'll say. Others in the world can get to that point because they've run out of fat cells. They don't have enough fat on them. That's true hunger, as opposed to the kind of temporary hunger that comes with, are my guts full at the moment?
Interesting. I love that explanation. So let's finish up on the book. Some more details on it, and specifically with regards to the virus that's going on. Because I think if you look at this, why we get sick, and we've talked all about hyperinsulinemia throughout this conversation, but it's very interesting that it dovetails into this chronic and, this acute pandemic that we're dealing with, this coronavirus. And if you look at the clinical characteristics that came from Wuhan, Italy, New York, now from the U.S., we know that the common comorbidities are hyperinsulinemia-related diseases, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and all that. So it's interesting that both from an acute standpoint and a chronic standpoint, this hyperinsulinemia is rearing its ugly head and Really, I mean, what a great time to put this out there, because I think people really need to hear this message, because the dogma right now from our public health experts is just socially distance, wear a mask. There's been no recommendations on diet or exercise or anything. You see people, I see them, you probably see them at the grocery store. They have Mountain Dew and bread and it's like, oh,
they're
man.
stocking up on Mountain Dew to get through the pandemic.
My gosh.
Yeah. So it is an uncomfortable conversation. And so I can see why health officials haven't wanted to, although I still think it's inexcusable. It needs to be addressed. The data out of New York published in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that 94% of everyone whose infection was bad enough that they had to go to the hospital, 94% of these people had a pre-existing condition. 88% of them had 2 or more of these pre-existing conditions. And when you look at the list of the pre-existing conditions, obesity is absolute number 1 by a wide margin, over hypertension and diabetes being the next ones. If you put all the obesity classifications in one, which I think we ought to, someone who has too much fat tissue, that is the leading reason that they're going to be hospitalized due to a COVID-19 infection. And to your point, hypertension and diabetes, we are looking at this kind of triad of metabolic syndrome. They are aspects of metabolic syndrome: obesity, hypertension, and high blood glucose, which is type 2 diabetes. Those are all part of this metabolic syndrome, aka the insulin resistance syndrome. One of the most provocative sort of dives into this, and why obesity, why is it too much fat and too much fat cells? The suspected receptor that allows the virus to get into and infect a cell, because that's what has to happen. It's not just the virus is in your body, you've inhaled it. It has to get into a cell to be infectious. One of the suspected a co-receptor for this to happen is called ACE2. And so this ACE2 protein facilitates the virus getting into the cell. What's so interesting is that fat cells are among the highest expressors of ACE2. So fat cells can have more ACE2, this little site where the virus can get into the cell, than almost every other cell in the body. I think it's second maybe just to the kidney, if I'm remembering correctly, oddly enough, although I don't know that people are having kidney problems. But the virus, if you have a lot of fat cells, it's easy to imagine, and I'm speculating, that just is this many more ways for the virus to actually get into a cell, infect a cell, and start replicating. Because that's what it needs to do. It needs to get into a cell, hijack the machinery, start replicating its own proteins, its own virus proteins, and then sharing those with the rest of the body. I think that is very likely part of this pathology with this COVID-19 fear. And as much as recommendations may be well-intentioned, social distancing, mask wearing, etc., I believe that this is a virus that is not going away. I believe it is here to stay. It is now part of the ecosystem, if you will. It's a new disease that we just are going to be fighting with now until the end of time. So it behooves us to address it in ways that I believe are going to be more efficient than continuing to just lock down the whole economy and the whole world. At some point, I think everyone can agree, even the most staunch lockdown advocates, I would hope, that we can't do that indefinitely. And so I think we do need to get to this more nuanced conversation, which is how do we identify the people with the highest risk? We've identified them. It's these comorbidities. What can we do about it? We have to start talking about lifestyle, and we have to start challenging the dogma of eat less, exercise more in order to help address these comorbidities. We've been saying that for decades, and we're no better off now.
I agree 100%. So to kind of recap that, the viral load, having more fat cells may be increasing the propensity to have more viral load, which leads to complications, cytokine storms, ICUs, etc.
Yep. And speaking of a cytokine storm, one of the implicated proteins in a cytokine storm is a protein called plasminogen activator inhibitor, PAI. And there's actually a small little family there. The most prominent source, briefly, plasminogen activator inhibitor is a protein that blocks blood clot breakdown. So plasminogen will come in and it will create this plasmin, and plasmin is like a little bomb that will come in, or a little scissors, and it'll cut up a blood clot to allow it to degrade. This happens all the time. This idea of fibrinolysis, we're forming blood clots and we're breaking them down. It's happening all the time in the human body. blood clots are thought to be one of the leading causes of mortality with COVID-19 infections. Adipocytes make more of this plasminogen activator inhibitor than any cell in the body. So speaking of and it's considered a cytokine.
Yeah.
So talking about a cytokine storm, when inflammation is getting rampant, the fat cells are extremely capable of making cytokines, including this one that blocks the breakdown of clots. And clots are, we suspect, one of the main aspects of lethality of the infection.
Well, you hear about a lot of younger people stroking out afterwards. So that's really interesting. So it could be fat cell mediated. I've always thought it like pi 1, they call it. Like, isn't there pi 2 in this?
Yes. Yeah. So it is PAI 1.
Okay, interesting. That's super fascinating that there's that connection. So it just as an anecdote, I share this on Instagram. The media often runs with a story, healthy 28-year-old, healthy 32-year-old, healthy 43. So I do some digging, and if I find, it happens every single time, the food pictures are just atrocious. There's not one picture
that the person's sharing on social media.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, this one guy, Mike Schultz, was a great example. Is on BuzzFeed. Tim Ferriss retweeted this. He was drinking a big, like a liter soda in the intensive care unit. After
my goodness.
He almost died. So he was in the ICU for like 63 days in a coma. And that was one of the first pieces of food that he had. Then he went to McDonald's on the way home from the hospital. Anyway, so the media made a big stink about it, but didn't look at this. So then it goes back to your point. And the point of your book is like, hey, look, he probably has some underlying hyperinsulinemia just because he looked physically healthy on the outside. And there was many other cases of this. Anyway.
Yeah. So we do need to scrutinize as we anticipate living with this virus forever. Because let's even say we get a vaccine, we don't know how effective this thing's going to be. I think it is a bit of a misplaced hope, really relying on this idea that a vaccine's going to just nail it and we're going to be all cured of this. I think that's a little misplaced, to be polite about it. So we do need to get serious about the conversation and acknowledging the comorbidities. And why wouldn't we? It's not like people want to live with these comorbidities. Let's get more serious about addressing them. Sure, let's continue to study viruses, continue to study vaccines. That's fine and dandy. But let's acknowledge the metabolic foundation that makes an infectious disease, even beyond COVID-19, far more infectious and lethal than it needs to be.
I think it's an awesome motivator for a lot of people to realize, like, because there was really no consequences to being overweight, diabetic, hypertensive, because you can go and get a medication. You can get bariatric surgery if you need to. Now it's like, hey, there's this lethal virus for which we have no treatment. The only thing you can do is become healthier. And I think it's inspired a lot of, hopefully, some people took the quarantine and drank booze and did all this. But other people are like, you know what? I'm going to double down on fasting. My mom started keto. You know, my dad was doing a lot more stuff. So it was really cool to see. But I think that's why your book is a great tool, because it gives people the foundations to understand, hey, here's how the things that you eat when you eat or when you fast, how that affects every system in your body, which I think is really important, from neurodegeneration to fatty liver disease to cancer to you name it.
Yeah.
So thanks for putting that all together.
Oh, well, it was an effort of love, frankly. It really was just to kind of meet a few specific aims, inform the average person about this disease that is the most commonest health disorder in the world. Let them know they might have it. They very likely do. Let them know what are the diseases that come from that, like all the chronic disorders that stem from insulin resistance, how you get insulin resistance, and then the happy ending, which is what to do about it. And I try to, throughout the book, the editor that I had, who was just brilliant, Claire Schultz, she helped me turn my tendency towards more complication in the writing, more complicated writing, to just being really lucid, very easy to get through. But it's a happy ending. It's awesome. It is that this is a disorder that is very well controlled through diet,
and it's manageable and reversible.
That's right.
It's modifiable, which is amazing.
Yeah, very, very rapidly too. Yeah. And I kind of outline these three pillars. With the fourth being fasting, but it's control carbohydrates, prioritize protein, make sure you're getting enough protein, and the best, which is always going to be animal protein, as inconvenient as that is. Animal protein is the best protein with regards to the amino acid profile, with regards to the absorption of it, where plant proteins always have nutrient molecules that inhibit the digestion of their own protein. I'm unaware of a single plant protein that doesn't have anti-nutrients like tannins, phytates, and trypsin inhibitors. These are known in all plant proteins. So anyway, prioritize protein, and then fuel with fat or fill with fat. Let the remaining calories come from fat. It's a challenge to do that, where someone can look at those three pillars and acknowledge, okay, that is simple. Dr. Bikman stated that very simply. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. And in fact, one of my older brothers who was sort of tempting with, flirting with a low carb diet, he said, Ben, the challenge here is that it's hard. I mean, I have to plan my meals now, and I'm not really used to that. And in fact, it's a funny tangent, but that is both the blessing and the curse of a low carb diet. The blessing is you can't help but eat more real food because there's very little that's convenient that is in that low carb space. But that's the blessing. It's also the challenge. And so one of my brothers who came to me and he said, Ben, let's make the best low carb shake. Yeah. And just to put in a little plug for that, anyone listening, go to a website called Get Health, and health is spelled HLTH. Get Health, HLTH.com. And look at the shake. It's basically with those three pillars in mind. The fibers, the carbohydrates are predominantly fiber, and then it is the best animal proteins from whey and egg white, and those are the best, demonstrably the best proteins, and fats mostly from coconut and olive oil with some MCT and a little bit of butter as well. But what's so interesting about that mix, Mike, we as a culture are so obsessed on protein and protein powders, and we love protein powders, and protein matters, without a doubt. It is so relevant. But we know in humans, when you add fat to that protein, it helps the protein work better. This was a study that looked at muscle protein synthesis. When they gave exercising men a protein load, muscle protein synthesis was significantly increased. When they gave them a balance, a 1-to-1 by mass of protein and fat, there was a significant effect even beyond just the protein alone. So it's almost like these foods that always come together, these macronutrients, they were designed to come together. In nature, if you're looking for protein, you always get fat with it. There's no exception to this. The best proteins will always have fat coming along with it. And I think there's something kind of genius about it, and where it works better together. Let's do it together. And so indeed the shake, and I just helped with the formulation, it is this 1-to-1 balance of protein to fat. And in fact, everyone listening, use a high-intensity health code,
sure. HIH,
and you can get 10% off the order.
That's awesome.
So that has been a fun project to do with my brothers, and one of my other brothers handles all the fulfillment. He's kind of retired, and so it lets us keep the cost down. But give it a check. It really, if someone's wanting to get those three pillars and get the macros in line, it's an easy way to do it.
Totally. That's so cool. It's a family business. I didn't know that. I love
two of
that.
my older brothers. Now, Mike, that sounds like it's a big family business, but remember, I'm one of 8 boys.
Yeah.
And so it's only 3 of us, not to mention my 5 sisters who aren't a part of it.
Oh, it's amazing. Oh, and so here's how my wife and I have been using it. We like to have like a little bit of dessert at night. So we'll make some in the food processor, canned coconut milk,
yes,
a little bit of collagen, and then your product in there. And it's really a nice creamy consistency. It feels like you're having ice cream, but of course you're getting protein and fat. So that's how we like to, and then, just as a shake as well. But it's funny that you mentioned that about the muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah.
And what a lot of bodybuilders do now is like spend $60, $80 on a stripped down whey isolate. What's totally devoid of any fat. It's just the denatured, the extracted, protein. And they're wondering why they're hungry or they have issues or.
Not to mention hunger. I mean, there is a downside. As much as I am an advocate of prioritizing protein, if you're doing that at the expense of fat, I believe in particular, you are starting to you are circumventing normal human nutrition. And someone could, and I would say that meat is the perfect example. Meat and eggs, to me, represent this beautiful mix of fat and protein together. Chicken doesn't play by the same rules. And tellingly, we never used to eat chicken. This was not a meat source for our ancestors. We had chickens for the eggs. Now, if you look at chicken consumption, it went from almost nothing 100 years ago to being like maybe the single highest source of protein in the diet. I think as much as I love chicken, eating them, namely, I do think that if you are focusing your protein on just chicken, you are going to be devoid of fats. And frankly, you may be mitigating the anabolic effects of that protein. Protein is supposed to come with fat, so eat it that way.
I love that. And we have about 45, 50 chickens at my house right now.
That's awesome.
They're
And you're in Seattle?
we're totally breaking every rule and all that.
How do you have that much space?
Well, we have about a third of an acre. So I have these little chicken tractors where I fit like 20 of them and I move them around in the grass, and then we have the big coop in the back. So they're all of different sizes. We processed a bunch before we left town and stuff like that, and brought them with us actually. And my dad likes chicken, so I harvested 2 roosters, and they tasted so different, which is where I'm going with this. Is it's really easy to control and artificially manipulate chicken's environment, whereas with cattle, even the feedlot stuff, they still have to get out there and graze. And so that's why I'm not a huge fan of chicken. I love eggs like you, have them pretty much every single day. I love the yolks and everything, but I don't eat a lot of chicken meat because unless it's mine or I know the farmer.
That's awesome.
Because you can put them in a concrete facility. They never see dirt. They never touch bugs. All chickens do all day is dig for bugs, or they lay out in the sun.
Man, well, they're omnivores.
Right.
That's right. Yeah. So we really, I'll never forget this little video watching with my kids. You see a cat like playing with a mouse, and the chicken just comes out of nowhere, grabs the mouse, like snatches it from the cat's paws, and then eats that little mouse in seconds. I mean, these are little dinosaur beasts that are going to eat whatever they can get their hands on.
They're savage. I mean, if I put like a piece of meat out there or salmon, they'll just tear it up. And in fact, they'll tear the other chickens like. They're really food competitive, like they'll peck at the other ones and cause bleeding and all that. So anyway,
I'm telling you, they're little dinosaurs, man.
They are. They're beasts. I love them though. They're fun pets. Nez is playing with them all the time and all that. So it's always fun to catch up with you, and talk about these different things. So the book comes out, is it the 23rd?
July 21.
Okay.
So just a couple, well, depending on when this drops in the next couple of weeks.
Awesome.
Yeah, it really was an act of love. Just trying if I could distill, as I was thinking about it, more and more I thought I have a message to tell, and that is the world needs to be aware of insulin resistance. That really was the justification for the book. It was what prompted me to do it. I would have people come up, I'd get done lectures to the public, and people would say, where can I get your book? And I'd think, I don't have a book. I need a book. I need to be able to tell the story because no one's told it yet. And that's the book.
It's important. So friends, if you're listening, I would love for you to get the book. Go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, wherever you love books. And most importantly, write a review and share it with a friend or family member, because that's key, because the reviews are really essential. And I know a lot of our listeners have already listened to your past episodes. So please pay it forward, buy the book, and write a review.
That's great.
Ben, as always, thanks for coming on. And I'll put links to
GetHealth.com.
GetHealth.com. Okay. Links there and everything like that.
And remember the coupon code, HIH.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on again.
Thanks so much, Mike. This was awesome.
Fun.